All right, well, thanks, Taylor. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. And I'm going to touch on a couple of things that were just mentioned. So that is exciting to hear. So everyone can see my slides okay?
Yes.
Awesome, thanks. So as Taylor said, I'm with the University of Arizona. I'm a water quality specialist, but have moved kind of into the food safety realm. And really that was in response to grower needs. And we're excited to kind of share some of the introductory food safety segments of the produce safety rule. And we'll go over a little bit about that today. And if there's any questions that you guys have, please feel free to reach out afterwards. So let's see if I can move my slides. All right. So as we just talked about, a bit, food safety is super important, specifically when we're considering produce that's grown fresh and that's eaten fresh. We work with the Arizona Department of Agriculture to deploy produce safety rule grower training, which is now part of that certification that was just chatted about a little bit. But we thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about some food safety concepts with you all today, because number one, you guys know your farm and practices better than anyone. And it's important, I think, for qualified individuals and also folks that don't necessarily have to have that food safety certification, really to have that same level of understanding and knowledge related to food safety, because ultimately your actions are going to directly impact food safety on your farm and then also your financial viability. So it's a super important component. So if you haven't heard of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, yet, this is what it includes. So there's a number of different subsections under the new regulations under the Food and Drug Administration, so FDA. And the one that I'm primarily going to be talking about today is the Produce Safety Rule. But you can see the others that are listed there as well. The Produce Safety Rule specifically looks at growers, shippers, and handlers of fresh produce, looks at their annual sales or their gross sales related to their produce, and then ranks them based on their farm size and sales with compliance dates specifically for implementation of a variety of food safety practices. I think it's important to note that this is the first time that we see regulation of food safety on a national scale. And so a lot of it is new for a number of growers. And so we at Cooperative Extension work with the Department of Ag side by side to work, boots on the ground with growers to be able to understand the rule, understand how they can comply with the rule, and be prepared in the future if they were ever to become audited under this new regulation. So here's the team. We have a number of awesome individuals, both at the University of Arizona and also the Department of Agriculture. And we've been working at deploying produce safety rule grower trainings for about 5 years. And so it's both the U of A and the Arizona Department of Ag working side by side. So we do a couple of different things. So COVID was a little bit weird for us in that we had to pivot and transition from doing face-to-face delivery of grower trainings to also remote grower training. So here's a screenshot of us all doing our produce safety rule grower training remotely, similar to this. We are starting to transition back to face-to-face delivery, which is exciting for us. We enjoy being in a room and we enjoy being side by side, shoulder to shoulder with growers so that we can have a chance to chat and talk about challenges that you all face. I will say that we have a diverse number of attendees from Arizona and also other states. So when we transitioned to remote, that also opened up the opportunity for us to interact with growers beyond just the state of Arizona, or growers that are growing in Arizona and then in other locations, say California, for example. We do train small and very small growers as well, so those that might be qualified exempt. But we do feel that because food safety is such an important issue, that we're not going to exclude anyone. We want to be really inclusive. In addition to grower trainings, we also do something called an OFRR, or an on-farm readiness review. And basically what that is a member of Department of Ag, and usually myself, will come visit your farm at your request And we will just walk around and talk to you about your practices and talk about the produce safety rule and go through a series of questions. But really, it's an opportunity for you all as growers to ask us questions that will help prepare you for implementation of the produce safety rule. We don't take any notes. We don't write anything down. We don't keep track of anything. It's really just to get to know you, have you all be able to have the opportunity to ask questions and to be prepared for implementation of the rule. In addition to on-farm readiness reviews and produce safety rule grower trainings, I do have a research lab at the University of Arizona in the city of Maricopa and then also in Yuma. So we do a number of different research projects specifically with industry targeting food safety questions. And so here's some of our staff members looking at agriculture water treatment. As Taylor mentioned, we do a lot on ag water treatment. And this is working with some specific spinach and romaine organic produce growers that have to implement water treatment to meet their regulations. So in addition to those in-depth trainings, we put out multiple different content types specifically related to grower questions that we've received. So we have extension publications, a number of different workshops, and also hands-on activities that we would love to share with you. So I'll get Taylor a list of some of those more recent extension publications focused on food safety that we will share out with each of you. So back to the produce safety rule. So this is the first ever kind of mandatory federal standard for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh produce. As I said a little bit earlier, some growers may be eligible for an exemption, and that's really dependent on a couple of things. So first, what are you growing? So are you growing something that's rarely consumed raw? If you are, then you're probably going to be exempt from the produce safety rule. The additional things might be that if you have a processing step that includes a kill step. So anything that might render those pathogens, a pathogen is something that we're concerned with that makes people sick. If it kills that pathogen, then you will be qualified exempt. The additional thing and the biggest thing is annual produce sales. And so I have a next slide that's going to go over that. And then also if you have annual food sales to a qualified end user. But as I said earlier, regardless if you're exempt or not, we feel at the U of A and Department of Ag that ultimately all growers should understand and take action to reduce food safety risks on the farm, right? It's not in your best interest to make your consumers sick and not be able to buy produce from you in the future. And so your commitment to food safety is really important. And we applaud growers who take effort in enhancing produce safety and being aware of that. So here's the rule compliance states based on your business size. So the initial compliance states were in 2018 for businesses over 500,000, and this is a rolling average of your past 3 years. For small businesses between 250 to 500,000, it was in 2019. And then for very small businesses, so greater than 25,000 to 250,000 was in 2020. So one exception to this are those water-related compliance states. As you can see, for those other businesses over 500K, the water compliance states are set for January of 2022. We're still waiting to hear on the revisions to the agriculture water rule. So we anticipate those dates for compliance being pushed back even further than January of 2022. So I thought it was important to kind of show you all a little overview of outbreaks associated with produce and why we feel that this is so important. So these are specific FDA outbreaks that are linked to produce contamination between 96 and 2014. So this has shifted a bit in recent years, but as you can largely see, leafy greens takes up a large percentage of that pie. Sprouts is there, melons is another big one, and then you can kind of see it broken down into smaller areas. So tomatoes, berries, herbs, and all those different things. So because of the large amount of outbreaks that have been linked to produce as opposed to linked to protein or other things like that, the FDA felt that it was important to have kind of these national level standards that kind of brought everybody up to the same level of understanding related to food safety. So the biggest things that we're concerned with, specifically related to the consumption of fresh produce, are going to be these microorganisms or these pathogens. So a lot of times we're all really familiar about the bacterial ones. Oftentimes in the news, you hear about things like Salmonella or E. coli or Listeria. There's an outbreak currently ongoing right now related to onions. And I believe that it is E. coli. It could be E. coli or Salmonella. I'd have to go back and look. But more generally, we do see bacterial pathogens linked to fresh produce outbreaks. Some rare occurrences, we've seen some virus related outbreaks. Oftentimes norovirus is a really popular one, hepatitis. And then that last group is parasites. And so the one that's getting a lot of attention right now is Cyclospora. So parasites are a bit bigger than bacteria or viruses. They're not very well adapted to the environment, or they are very well adapted to the environment, and they can resist kind of any kind of heat treatment or chemical disinfection potentially that's there. And so we've seen Cyclospora linked to cabbage. We've also seen it linked to other leafy greens. And a lot of that has been coming out of the Florida growing region. And so because of that, FDA has kind of heightened their awareness of Cyclospora and trying to better understand its prevalence and persistence in the environment. So again, thinking about bacteria in the farm environment, we know based on what we see in the literature and past outbreaks that some of these pathogens can multiply both inside and outside of the host. The host, for example, could be myself as a person having a pathogen in my intestine, but also think about animals too. Animals are really big reservoirs for certain types of pathogens, and we have to be really aware of the potential for animals in and around produce growing environments and their potential to transfer these pathogens into the environment and how that could get onto your produce. So in general, good agricultural practices can reduce risks really by minimizing the situations that we just mentioned that support bacterial survival and growth. And so really trying to maintain the cold chain, understand what crop inputs you're adding onto your farm, and really trying to minimize the potential for these bacteria, viruses, or protozoa to even get onto your produce in the first place. However, there are challenges, right? And because produce is often consumed raw or not cooked, it's a potential to be there, and we have to be really aware. Additionally, what we've seen in things like melons, for example, we know that microbial contamination on produce can be difficult to remove once it's present. So if you think of that netting on that center picture on the bottom, that netting that's on the surface of a melon, those are great areas, those rough surfaces for bacteria to cling to and to hang on to. So even if you scrub or wash your produce, they can still kind of hang on beyond that. So it's really important to think about, not just getting the produce contaminated in the first place, but potentially once it's there and how it might stick around for extended periods of time. So in general, when we think about contamination sources, obviously I mentioned animals as one of the top concerns. People are another big concern. Obviously, the folks that are harvesting or applying crop products or marketing your foods or bringing them to market are all potential. But we also have to think about other areas. So what's going on in your soil? What's going on to your soil amendments? What's going on next door to where you're growing produce? Water is a big one that I deal with, specifically looking at organisms that live out in the open environment and live in our surface water sources, specifically in Arizona, and how the potential for pathogens in water can then transport that bacteria or that virus or that protozoa onto your produce. And then lastly, buildings, equipment, and tools. So I think we talk a lot about equipment, cleaning and sanitation. We talk about tools, harvesting tools as well. We also have to think about the buildings or the structures that we are bringing our produce in and around, and also the potential, what was this used for, what was this tool used for yesterday? Did we clean and sanitize it before it was used today? How is it stored? How are we tracking all of this information? So I'll go through each of these different contamination areas and real quickly and think about, have you guys kind of think about what you do on your own farm and how this might apply. So obviously people, primarily workers, the biggest thing that we see when we go out to do on-farm readiness reviews is improper health and hygiene practices. So the number one thing that each of you all can do to increase or decrease your potential for transferring pathogens in and around your farm is hand washing, and teaching great hand washing skills to your workforce and yourselves. So we go out with Department of Ag to help teach hand washing, and it may seem silly, but it's amazing, the variety. If you just tell people to go wash their hands and watch them all, there's a variety of different ways that people do it. And so we really want to stress the importance of hand washing. Another issue is around illness and injury. So folks that might be working while sick, injuries that result in blood contacting fresh produce, those are all potential areas that could result in a food safety issue. So again, here's those routes of contamination related to people. Obviously, we talked about hand washing and hands and illness and injury, but also here's some other things we don't necessarily talk about, like clothing and footwear. So some farms that have both animals and produce on their property, you really should think about the way that you move in and around your animals, and then are you going into a field that is then going to be harvested? So potentially you could be picking up bacteria and feces on your footwear, on your clothes, and then walking into a produce production environment and taking that with you. So it's important to think about that chain of flow and that process and how people are moving, having dedicated clothing or dedicated footwear to a specific area, different things like that. So again, hand washing, these are one of the questions that we had on the pre and post test. So when must you wash your hands? After using the toilet, before starting returning to work, before and after eating or smoking, before you put on those gloves. I know a lot of people like to use gloves these days. There's good things about gloves, and there's also some bad things about gloves. After touching animals or animal waste, and really kind of any other times that hands may become contaminated. So more recently, we've talked a lot about soil amendments, switching gears a bit. So raw manure is a big, scary thing, potentially non-composted manure, because we know that bacteria, viruses, other pathogens live in the guts of animals. And so if you're using manure as a soil amendment that hasn't been properly handled or applied, or hasn't necessarily been composted properly, is a huge risk to transference of pathogens in that environment. But beyond just adding a soil amendment, we also have to think about, well, where are we storing it? What happens when there's a high wind event? Or what happens when you have rain or runoff? Or what happens if you are parking a tractor that's used for harvesting next to a compost pile? Are there potential situations that you can identify on your farm that might lead to cross-contamination? And I think that's kind of eye-opening for some folks. And so we try to really stress that, to think about beyond just the straightforward contamination on your field through application. What are other ways that could happen? Animals, again, I talked about this as a big one, and both domestic and wild animals can carry and transmit human pathogens to produce. I think most growers do a really nice job of looking for animal intrusion events or results in direct fecal contamination of crops. We teach a lot of folks to look for the potential impact of animals, or, do you see footprints? Do you see areas where they bedded down for the night? Do you see animals that are constantly wading in or around your water sources as potential routes of contamination? So we know, and we've documented, runoff from fields that contain manure can contaminate your fields and water sources and crops. So it's really important to pay attention to your adjacent land uses and the potential there. Water, as we just said, water is a really great, unfortunately, carrier of human pathogens, and it can move from pathogens from one location to another. Under the produce safety rule, they break up water into 3 different areas: production water, post-harvest water, and then kind of these unexpected events. So think about beyond just production water, water that you're using to irrigate your crops or do a frost protection or crop spray, but also think about post-harvest water uses. Or do you use a flume? Do you use water to do some sort of addition of waxing or cleaning or cooling of produce? So water quality matters, and we teach how to either receive tests for your water sources to say that they're safe, or how to do the tests yourself. All right, and lastly, I mentioned a lot of times we think about harvest tools, but we don't necessarily think too much about surfaces of other equipment or buildings. So any unclean surface that contacts produce potentially can harbor pathogens and serves as a source for contamination. So it's really important to think about the surfaces that produce is going to touch beyond just a harvest tool or someone's hands. Think about the bins, are they reusable bins? Where were they stored? Have they been cleaned and sanitized in between usage for different produce types? We've seen some examples where everybody's doing all the right things, but their storage areas had places where birds would come and sit in the rafters, and then they would unfortunately defecate onto different surfaces that you wouldn't necessarily see right away. So beyond just, how you're managing your surfaces or your tools or your harvest bins, things like that, think about where they're being stored and then are there potentials there. I do think it's important to note, there's a difference between cleaning and sanitizing. So cleaning is the physical removal of dirt or soil or organic matter on a surface. And you can use a detergent, you can use clean water. However, sanitizing is specifically defined as treatment of a clean surface to reduce or eliminate microorganisms. And oftentimes sanitizing uses some sort of chemical treatment. So we'll just think, chlorine is a really good example of that. Using chlorine to make sure that the bacteria on that surface is killed. So it's really important. You can't sanitize a dirty surface. And so cleaning always comes first. So when we come out to visit farms and talk about their policies or procedures, we always talk about this 2-step. We always make sure they're documenting that and understand that if you've got a really dirty surface with a bunch of dirt and organic matter, that sanitizer is never going to be able to work. That sanitizer is going to get consumed really, really quickly. All right. So obviously produce safety begins with your commitment, right? So walking around your farm, identifying the risks, and then supporting the implementation of some of these policies and practices that I just reviewed for you all today. So when we do the full produce safety rule grower training, each one of these areas is broken down into a module. Generally, we will spend time on each of these areas and provide you with education and resources to be able to do this implementation of these food safety policies and practices on your own farm. So generally we break these up into 5 areas. So obviously assessing your current risks, implementing those food safety practices, learning how to monitor practices. And then if you're monitoring those practices and you find something that has deviated from how you've outlined the practices you'd want to follow, using corrective actions to be able to correct that and bring yourself back into compliance. And then how you do all of this through record keeping. So again, assessing your farm and your practices, looking at those adjacent land use activities, looking at the use of your water, talking to your workers about their health and hygiene and those practices, and trying to identify what are typical and then what we consider atypical or not normal situations. Once you've identified those risks, you're going to implement those practices that you've learned or have learned, over the years. And it's important to note that there might be no modifications to the things that you do, but in other cases there might be, and that might require some capital investment. But, it's important to understand that there's a lot of resources available to very small to very large growers, and to ask help and seek training if you're unsure. So that's part of our job, to be able to provide resources to industry. Another important thing is to think about monitoring. So monitoring is important because if you never record those practices that you do, then you can never prove to an auditor or to someone that your end user, for example, that you're meeting those food safety performance guidelines. And so monitoring is important, and that allows you to verify those practices are being completed properly. There's a number of different ways that someone can monitor their practices, and they're all different, and it's all very specific to your own growing environment. Again, corrective actions, hopefully no one has had to go through this, but certainly we know that it does happen sometimes. It's great to have them established well in advance, so that you can identify the problem, fix it, and then be able to move through that very quickly. So here's an example. We have a porta potty that tipped over, and having a corrective action so that you can ensure that nothing from this porta potty had contaminated your field, and that you can kind of move through and document that it was a non-issue related to produce safety. So the way that you are able, and I think Trent's going to talk a bit about record keeping too, is related to monitoring and record keeping to be able to prove. So record keeping includes documents and practices, and monitoring and corrective actions. There's a ton of different templates that are available, and they should be really convenient and easily accessible. Under the produce safety rule, it's required that all records are kept for at least 2 years. And so that you be able to pull them out in an example of an audit and be able to prove through your record keeping that you were able to maintain those food safety practices. Some of the benefits, obviously you can verify that the practice was done properly. You can look for potential trends. If you start to see the same thing occurring over and over again, you might want to change a practice or do an additional training or speak to employees about what they are or are not doing. And so those are some of the great things. And then I also think it's important to note that record keeping doesn't have to be complex, right? It can be handwritten, pen and paper. We've seen some really fancy electronic kind of handheld data entry systems on cell phones and on iPads and things like that. You can use technology to your advantage, but you don't have to, right? They can be very simple and very low cost and still be able to meet your record keeping needs. And then the last thing as I wind out my time, one of the things we also help farms do is develop a farm food safety plan. So it's not required by the FSMA, produce safety rule, but it's a good idea. And really that can help you be organized and focus your time and resources more effectively. It also helps you document your progress. And sometimes we see farm food safety plans required by either third-party auditors or some buyers. So it really depends on your size and scale, but it's a good idea just to outline your practices and what you do and how you respond to potential food safety issues. So I know we're short on time and Taylor will share these slides, but please feel free to reach out to us related to produce safety rule grower trainings or on-farm readiness reviews. We're very happy to help. We're excited to learn more about all the amazing produce grown in the state and to help growers be successful at implementing food safety and food safety plans to enhance those safety efforts. So here's my email there. I'll go ahead and end. If Taylor wants to put that in the chat as well, I appreciate it. I'll stick around kind of for the rest of the day, and I'm excited to hear more about this training. Thanks so much.